Hey everyone, I wanted to do a follow-up to my video on scale that I only put up yesterday, but it's prompted a lot of response and comments and interest, and I wanted to kind of respond to the responses and give you a few more thoughts. Now the first thing that strikes me is that this scale creep effect and the divergence in definitions of what scale means is far more noticeable to someone of my generation than to a younger wargamer. To give you an example of that, this isn't a particularly old catalogue. I wrote on it March 2000. It's the Irregular Miniatures 25mm catalogue. Now I've got quite a lot of irregular figures. As I've said in previous videos, they're not a brilliant range, but they're very useful. If I were to purchase them nowadays, go to the Irregular website, I would discover that they're not categorised as 25mm any longer. Irregular don't have any 25mm in their range. You go straight from 20mm to 28mm, and all the figures that I have been redefined as 28mm. Now, if I was if I was a younger wargamer, I wouldn't even notice that. It's striking to me because suddenly all my figures have suddenly grown in size in their boxes. It's clearly a discrepancy or a change in definition of scale that Irregular have chosen to make. So I've got quite a few more figures out now, just to sort of like demonstrate some of my points. Because the other thing I want to the other historic change that I want to show you. Irregular aren't the only company to have done this. Another one, which is more pertinent really to my argument, is Old Glory, who span the Atlantic. Basically, Old Glory figures are sold in the UK by, I don't know if you can describe it. This is where I might be inaccurate in what I'm telling you, but the company in Old Glory UK are related in some way to Old Glory in the US, but I don't think they are subsidiary to them. I think they are a separate company trading using their name. Might be completely wrong in that, but there's definitely a link, but it's not a close link. But as I say, it might be wrong. Anyway, Beckus in Australia made a comment, and he simply said Blue Moon are 18mm. Now, if you look at the Blue Moon range on the Old Glory UK site, they are very categorically described as 15mm. So Beckus in a way is talking at odds with the company that sell Blue Moon in the UK. If you go to the US website, which is the company's name is Old Glory 25s. Now this goes back to my point about how Old Glory have made a similar redefinition of what 25 millimeters scale is, but unfortunately for them, they are tied to their trading name in the US, which is Old Glory 25. In the UK, that 25 has been dropped very conveniently, but ironically, they have retained the old scaling definitions. But anyway, if you go to the Old Glory 25's US website, you will see that Blue Moon are categorized as 15/18 mil. So at first glance, there's an immediate suggestion that the Blue Moon figures are larger than they actually are. And I say that because I've been looking at these Blue Moon horses that I got again. I've got two out this time, and you can see their size there. And I've got one of the riders, which I haven't primed here. Now, I know there's no comparison for you immediately to show that, but looking at it, there is absolutely no way that I would consider that to be an 18 mil figure. That is out and out 15 mil. So to give you a comparison, I've got out an 18 mil Eureka figure, or pair of figures from the Crimean War, and I think you can see there a massive difference. This is the same difference that I showed you on the previous video between Blue Moon, which is described in America as 18 mil, and Eureka, which is marketed as 18 mil, and it's an Australian company, which is relevant to the fact that Bacchus is an Australian, and he is presumably thinking in Australian terms, if there is such a thing, of scale. Now, I've got here a pair of figures which are from a range that's no longer available, tumbling dice, 20 mil Crimean War figures. They're Lancers, just as these Eureka 18 mil figures are. Now, something that's just occurred to me overnight since my last video went up is that when I first was planning to wargame the Crimean War, I was going to go down the tumbling dice route of 20 millimeter, and I am sure, but I now can't prove it, so it's just a sort of vague memory in my mind that I purchased some Eureka figures to see if they would complement the tumbling dice figures, and they clearly don't. But I did that because at the time these were labelled as 20 millimeter figures. So I can't prove it, but I strongly suspect that Eureka have also adjusted their definitions of scale, and they have described these as 18 mil, which to my subjective point of view is a more accurate description of their size. So I'm not complaining that they've redefined this scale. All I'm saying is that you've got three ranges there already: Irregular, Old Glory, and Eureka, who have all sort of not surreptitiously, but they have all changed their scale definitions without really broadcasting the fact that they've done it. They've just it's just sort of slipped in under the radar as the years have gone by. Now, I mentioned that business of Old Glory 25s being hamstrung with their title. The same goes for Old Glory 15s. Now, again, my recollection of this may be incorrect, but I strongly I really do seem to remember that many years past, Old Glory 15s and Old Glory 25s were the same company, and they split. It was a long time ago, 20, 25 years ago, maybe even longer, but at one time Old Glory 15s belonged to the same company and were traded through under the same banner. Now again, you've got that legacy of the name Old Glory 15s. If you purchase an Old Glory 15 figure, you expect to acquire a 15mm figure. You don't expect to acquire an 18mm figure. So here I've got an Old Glory 15 figure. This is right, and this is another point as well. This is a figure that I purchased off of the American Old Glory 15's website, because Old Glory 15s are sold in the UK through a company called Timecast. I think it is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Timecast. And again, they have kept the label Old Glory 15s. So there is no way that they can suddenly turn around and say, right, we're selling you 18mm figures. And yet, if you look at the comparison in size of Blue Moon, 15mm in the UK, 18mm in the US, and Old Glory 15s, which has to be, it's tied into being 15mm in both countries. The Old Glory 15 is much bigger than the Blue Moon figure. So there has clearly been a decision on the part of some manufacturers to change their definitions of scale, and it's led to an enormous amount of confusion for old codgers like myself, who can remember when these figures were defined by a different scale. Just as almost as by the way as well, I've got another two pairs of figure stands out here. This is a Old Glory 15, so again has to be 15mm. Gallic chieftain on horse, and these are Peter Pig 15mm figures. So no doubt about what they are, and you can see again there is a difference in scale. The Old Glory is larger and the Peter Pig is smaller, which is why you will find a lot of people like Bacchus maybe telling you that this is 18mm, and you can see why he is warranted in making that statement, because proportionally this is probably the equivalent of 18 over 15 times bigger. So what I want to do is just in front of you do some arithmetic on paper, and I think you will see something quite interesting emerge out of the sums that clarifies this whole dilemma. Right, so got a trusty calculator and a pen and some notepaper. Right, so let's start by writing down some typical scales, and I'm going to start with 10mm because I think it's Peter Millen commented on the troubles that he is having wargaming in 10mm and often finding a lot of the figures that he purchases are 12mm high. There's the 20% discrepancy in the size of the figures that he's acquiring, and it's very confusing for him. And this is precisely the point I made on the previous video, that as you go up in scale, these divergences in scale definition don't impact so much on the visual effect, but in a small scale like 10mm, they are blatant and they really stand out on the tabletop. So I'm going to start with 10mm, but the important one is 15mm, because that is really, well, from my point of view, that is the range that I use as a sort of benchmark in order to kind of convert up to different sizes. You'll see what I mean in a moment. I want to discuss 18mm because that is the scale of these Eureka figures, and it's the scale that Blue Moon purport to be in the US. 20mm. I'm going to throw a little oddball in here of 21mm as well. I know that isn't a scale as such, it's not a commercially recognised scale, but you'll see why as I progress. I've got 25mm, which is the old scale that older wargamers imagined they were wargaming in when they purchased their minifigs Napoleonics and their Hinchcliffes and their irregular figures and so on. And 28mm, and another oddball here, you'll see why again in a minute. I'm going to put 31mm down rather than 30mm. So 30mm is that kind of heroic scale that you might get for, say, my jugular gladiators, that kind of thing. Larger figures that are produced for skirmish games very often, sort of heroic size, lots of detail on them, look really good on the tabletop, and to be honest, that you wouldn't really notice if it was 31mm scale. There's very little difference to see by eye in a 30mm figure and a 31mm figure, so you'll never see 31mm offered commercially, but I put 21 and 31 down for a specific reason that you'll see later. Right, now I want to kind of convert these from the millimetre scale to a fraction, and I'm going to start with what I would term, or what I understand to be, the USA's understanding of scale, which is based on the average height of a person or a soldier being 180 centimetres, which is about 5'10", 5'11". Okay. Now, this is going to involve a little bit of arithmetic now, but bear with me. So let's start with 15mm. And the reason I want to start there as well is not just simply because it's what I use as my baseline, but this is what is meant to equate in model railwaying terms to tabletop train sets, TT train sets, okay. If you divide 180 centimetres, which is 18,000 millimetres, by 15 to find out the scale, no, sorry, it's not, it's 180 times 10, not times 100. So 180 centimetres is 1800 millimetres. If you divide that by 15 millimetres, it comes out at 1 in 120. And 1 in 120 is TT scale in America. Right, now we can convert all these other, we can do the same arithmetic and convert all these other ranges and see what they turn out as. So 1800 divided by 10 is pretty easy arithmetic, is 1 in 180. 1800 divided by 18 is 1 in 100. 1800 divided by 20 is 1 in 90. 1800 divided by 21, this is one of my odd quirky ones, is 1 in 85. 1800 divided by 25 is 1 in 72. You'll begin to notice there are some, especially for older people, there are some significant figures, some significant figures. 1 in 72 is a very memorable scale for a lot of us older people who played with Airfix and had train sets and so on. Anyway, 1800 divided by 28 is 1 in 64, and 1800 divided by 31 is 1 in 58. Right, now what I want to do is look at the UK, where TT scale is defined as 1 in 100. And as I say, that has a knock-on effect to wargaming, or as I said on the previous video, that has a knock-on effect to wargaming because, don't ask me why, but for some reason 15mm wargaming scale is equated to TT, tabletop railway scale, and there is a difference in definition between America and between the UK, and therefore there is an immediate dilemma there for companies like Old Glory who span the Atlantic and who are based both in America and in Britain. But anyway, from this figure of 1 in 100, and to give you an example about how the wargaming scale is tied, which I did mention on my previous video, Peter Pig have a lot of who are this range here, who, if you remember, I know they're Romans, so Romans aren't going to have railways, but they have plenty of ranges set in the modern era, Great War range, Russian Civil War, ACW, all have model trains in their ranges that have to run on railway track, and they recommend the railway track being obtained from companies that sell TT railway track. I think they mentioned Pico as one of them. So there's a direct link there, and there is a problem in terms of definitions of scale now across the Atlantic. But anyway, if you do a little bit of reverse arithmetic now, and you take 1 in 100th as representing 15 mil, what does that mean for what is termed the average height of a normal soldier. Okay, what is the equivalent in the UK definition of this 180 centimetres? That's a pretty easy piece of arithmetic. You've just got to multiply 15 by 100 and you get 150 centimetres. Now, immediately you can see why, from an American point of view, that is nonsense, because 150 centimetres is just under 5 feet. It's only about 4 foot. It's 4.9. Sorry, so it's not 4 foot 9 inches. It's 4.9, so it's about 5 foot. Very short. Even historically. Excuse me a minute. I need to sneeze. Sorry about that. I'll do that off camera. Yeah, even historically, 5 foot is very short for a soldier. As I said, a lot of my relatives and ancestors who fought in the Great War were averaged about 5'4". So 5 foot is tiny. So it's a very odd choice to make, other than the fact that you can see that using the 100 makes the mathematics of these conversions for here much easier. Right, so here we go. Anyway, let's convert all these now so we get fractions for what they represent in the UK. So 150 centimetres divided by 10 is 1 in 150. 150 divided by 18 is 1 in 83. Hope I'm doing this right. 150 divided by 20 is 1 in 75. Yeah. 150 divided by 21. Sorry, 1500 divided by 21 is 1 in 71. 150 divided by, or 1500 divided by 25 is 1 in 60. 1500 divided by 28 is 1 in 53. 1500 divided by 31 is 1 in 48. Right, now, when you do these conversions, as I say, there are a number of very significant proportions that show up. In particular, 25 millimeters, this old-fashioned interpretation of scale that I was used to when I started wargaming, equates to 172, but to my mind 172 is the scale of those 20 millimeter airfix and figures, the HO00 kind of compatible scales. 00, by the way, is universally recognised as being 1 in 76, and look how close 20 millimeters and 21 millimeters are, by the UK definition, to 1/72. So this is where the confusion is arriving. That we almost sort of like had it inbred into us in the UK, that 1/72 is very close to 20 millimeters. It's actually 21 millimeters nearest, damn it. and that conforms pretty closely. 1 in 76, so 1 in 75 is pretty close to the double A scale. But I'm sort of like loyal to this scale, but at the same time I can see the reasoning behind this being wrong, because 5 foot for a standard human being is way too small a definition. You've got another striking figure here, that 18 millimeters in the US equates precisely to 1 in 100th, which is the precise definition of 15 millimeter, and therefore TT, or the other way around, in the UK. So there is a very obvious reason why 15 millimeter scale and 18 millimeter scale have been blurred together here. And this is precisely the reason why Blue Moon, which to my eye looks like a 15 millimeter figure, to an American is going to look like an 18 millimeter figure. And this is where Becker's, I know he's not American, he's Australian, this is where he's coming from, that he is adopting the American aesthetic, as it were, the American definitions of scale. And yet, one of the few figure manufacturers in Australia, Eureka, have decided that this is 18 millimeter. So the Eureka have now conformed to the UK standard. So let's have a look at that. As I say, at one time I'm pretty sure Eureka termed themselves 20 millimeter. Now by USA standards that's 1 in 90. That is halfway between, in the UK, between 18 millimeter scale and 15 millimeter scale. So you can see what they've done. They've changed in the opposite direction to Irregular and to Old Glory, who have switched from being 25 millimeters to 28 millimeter now. So they are going in one direction, and Eureka have gone in the other direction and decided to adopt the UK standards, and they're now defining their what was once 20 millimeter as 18 millimeter. And I kind of rest my case. This is where there is so much confusion, that what there needs to be, whether you are defining your figures in terms of their height or in terms of their fraction, what you need for both of those means of definition of scale is a description of what is being taken as the standard height of a human being. So you need to know not just whether it's 20 millimeter, or not just if it's 1 in 48, which is another significant fraction for modelers and wargamers of games like Bolt Action, if you're trying to get vehicles to fix in. But you need to know whether you're talking 150 standard height or 180 standard height. So this would solve the problem if figure manufacturers qualified all their statements about scale by what they are scaling their figures against. Is it 150 or is it 180? And that would solve the problem. But this is the whole reason why everybody is so confused and talking at cross purposes. So they're my final thoughts on it. Well, not my final thoughts, but they're my further thoughts on the subject. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.